The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to MLA's Productivity and Profitability webinar series. My name is Peter Haviland. I work with the Webinar Coordinators Aggregate Consulting. Tonight we're joined by Dr Paul Nilon from Nilon Farm Health, based out of Tasmania, and we're looking at key diseases to vaccinate against in cattle. Before I get into Paul's intro, I'd just like to share with you, if you're not familiar, the webinar platform's fairly basic. Probably the key feature I'll point out to you is the orange/yellow button. That'll allow you to minimize your screen view so you can see all of Paul's presentation clearly. We also encourage you to write in your questions, so that's in a little drop-down box there as they arise. Don't feel like you have to leave it to the end of the presentation. That'll allow us to group up your questions and get them handled in the correct order. The only final point I'll make before we get back into Paul's topic is we really value your insights and feedback for these events, and it helps shape and steer the program moving forward. So if you've got 1 to 2 minutes at the end of the event, or you have to drop out early, please complete the survey on the exit. So a little bit more on our speaker tonight. Paul's based in Tasmania at present. His uni degree in 1993 and moved into the McKinnon project to complete his master's 4 years later. So Paul's a bit of an authority in all things sheep and beef animal health wise, and this has been grounded obviously in his mixed practice experience as a veterinarian, and then more recently with over 16 years in sheep and beef consultancy. So keep it nice and short for you, Paul. We'll switch over now. You should receive your invite to take over.
That's it. Here it is. There we go.
All right, and I can hear you
see my
clearly.
screen?
Yep.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. All right, I'll go on to mute now. Paul, I'll be there in the background. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're all exceedingly well. Very cold here in Tas, but I shouldn't complain about that. So just one slight correction from Peter. I actually graduated in 1983, so amongst the Sheep Veterinary Society, I'm genuinely known now as the old bastard. Oops, there. Right. Okay. So just a brief overview of what we're going to look at tonight. I'll make some introductory comments. Then we're going to talk about what's available, why vaccines, situations where vaccines may not be appropriate. Sometimes they fail or they don't work if there's a difference. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to talk about production systems. And so we've divided it into three, and then we'll have some concluding comments, and we welcome your questions. Okay, so this subject I thought was going to be quite straightforward, but in fact, the more that I looked into it, the more rabbit holes I ended up going down, and unfortunately it probably means we've got too much information, but we'll try and plough through it anyway. And I guess what we're trying to achieve is to bring some nuance to the subject, so that from the veterinary side, we often tend to be fairly prescriptive and say things like, well, just because, there's a vaccine there, why don't you use it? And then on the producer side, we still have people who, only look at it as a cost. And I think there's probably a middle ground, and we'll try and find a way for you to look at vaccines to find that middle ground for your particular enterprise. So the aim is to make the case for vaccines as a frontline preventive for infectious diseases for which we have vaccines. We're going to give some general guidelines on when to use them or not use them, and then give some examples in different enterprise types. In terms of further sources of information, I'm going to suggest three. The local vet. We're not all dog and cat people, and they love to hear from farming clients and provide advice. Now, the pharmaceutical tech services vets are an absolute untapped resource. So I'm lucky because of being a vet, I can contact them at any time pretty much, but you guys can contact them as well. And although they're in pharmaceutical companies and their purpose in life is to sell product, I think you'll be quite astounded about how objective their information is. And they know their products extremely well, and they mostly know the opposition's products as well. So tap into them. And of course, there's any amount of information on online, both MLA and the various departmental websites, AgFacts and that sort of thing. Look, I guess my comment is that, you know, some of the information is perhaps a little bit too cursory. And so you might need to dig fairly deeply. And in recognition of the fact that the state of origin is on tonight, we probably are not going to be covering anything much sort of north of the New South Wales, Queensland border or the North Coast. So we're not going to be talking about vaccines that are related to the pastoral zone or the northern cattle system. Okay. If you want to have a look at this MLA fact sheet, vaccination for southern cattle, just Google that and it'll come up. It's part of a training program as well. This is really one of the better ones. So it's 5-6 pages long, a lot of information there. And the northern fact sheet is in train even as we speak. Okay, so these are the diseases for which there are cattle vaccines in Australia. Clostridial diseases, you all know about. Respiratory diseases, much more of a feedlot problem. Reproductive diseases, I'm sure you're familiar with most of those, except perhaps Bopreva, which in fact is an alternative to spaying cattle. Pink eye, warts, there's no commercial vaccine, but you can get custom-made vaccines for that. Gastrointestinal tract viruses and bacteria, plus of course bovine Johne's disease. Neurological botulism, which is really only a northern cattle problem. Circulatory babesiosis, again, a tick-associated problem, babesiosis and anaplasmosis. So APVMA has 45 registered products covering at least 24 different bugs and all their toxins. And those 45 products are recombined into all sorts of different things, 5-in-1, 7-in-1, 2-in-1 for some of the respiratory vaccines, and at least 1 4-in-1 for the gastrointestinal vaccines. Let's go to the other end of things. This is the study from 2015 on the most debilitating animal health problems in the cattle industry. So if we go through, we can see that one, these aren't coming up in the right order, but never mind. They're the diseases which are both infectious and for which there is a vaccine. So at this stage of the game, damn near every major infectious disease in cattle ranked in this study is one for which there is a vaccine. And I guess I'd particularly highlight bovine virus diarrhea, BVD, botulism, and for our southern producers, vibriosis, pink eye. Bovine ephemeral fever, as the name suggests, comes and goes. The other thing to notice, in fact, is that for every disease listed there, the production costs are way, way greater than the prevention costs, which is obviously the vaccinal component. Not the only one, but a major one. So why would we vaccinate? Well, I think that the first cab off the rank is animal welfare. So to quote the recently retired head of animal welfare and health with MLA, the sheep and beef industries must move rapidly to prepare for the day of no surgical intervention. We have no more than 20 years. Exactly the same applies, so the same general animal welfare concerns apply for diseases that are preventable with vaccination and that cause animal welfare concerns. So the big ones there are probably going to be BRD in our feedlots, fertility control in the north, and sporadically things like pink eye in our southern herds as well. So animal welfare, in my opinion, is always a major consideration in any discussion on whether we should be vaccinating or not. The second point that we'd make is that vaccines in general are the most cost-effective way of preventing and or limiting the production impacts of the diseases for which there are vaccines. So I guess implicit in that statement is that not all vaccines provide anything like 100% prevention, and we'll come back to that time and again throughout the course of the talk. So to expand on point 2, we can see that the productivity is increased by reduced deaths, reduced treatment costs. And one of the things that I'd really like to highlight there is that increasingly QA programs are calling for no antimicrobials. And if animals are treated with antimicrobials, then in fact they can get pretty fair discounts from the processors and or further down the chain. So if you don't want to create animal welfare dilemmas by not using the antimicrobials when they need to be, the obvious point of reference is a vaccine if there's one available to help you limit the spread of the disease. And of course, some of these vaccines directly increase productivity or at least limit productivity losses. So in the case of pink eye, you try to get sort of cattle that are on great pasture growing at 1.5 kilos a day and pink eye is going through them, you've got no chance, absolutely none. The final point I'd make is that very rarely we can use this as a preemptive strike / biosecurity measure. And I guess the classic one for that is bovine ephemeral fever. So in the chronically infected areas, whether you're vaccinated or not is probably going to be determined by seroconversion rates. But in a year like we've just had, it has spread way south. And so I dare say some people have been trying to get ahead of the game by hitting their cattle with a ephemeral fever vaccine in advance of it hitting them. So why would we not vaccinate? Well, for starters, some vaccines are subject to regulatory control, and the two that spring to mind, of course, are anthrax and bovine Johne's disease. So you're not just going to go and grab those vaccines off the shelf and use them. You will have to have some level of permission, usually from the chief veterinary officer in your state. And in some cases, for example, we can't have anthrax vaccine in Tasmania under any circumstance unless it is associated with limited use for export. Which brings us to the next point, that in fact, depending on the testing requirements for individual importing countries or countries to which you might be exporting, you may sort of not vaccinate or only vaccinate a non-dependent part of your herd to make sure that you meet those export requirements. Patently, if you are in a no-risk zone or a very low-risk zone, you're not going to be doing it as a routine, at least, and so that's almost a no-brainer, isn't it? But botulism sort of rarely strays sort of south of the Queensland border, although there are occasional outbreaks associated with contaminated feed, and the anthrax belt, as I'm sure you all know, is very well defined. Pardon me. So that brings us to the point that we can vaccinate on an as-needs basis as risks change. The critical thing here, of course, is that it needs to be proactive rather than reactive, because if it's reactive, basically you've missed the boat and the benefit that you receive is going to be diminished. And it also goes without saying that it can be associated with changing seasons or enterprise or stock movements. So, for example, if you are bringing in droughted cattle from the north of Australia to somewhere in Tasmania or Victoria or wherever, weak, droughted stock, long-haul transport predisposes them to a whole range of diseases, including BRD, pardon me again, and pink eye. And I guess the final point is that for some diseases, and we're going to discuss at least one in, maybe even two in some detail, you can do fairly good cost benefits or return on investment type calculations. And for some diseases that don't pose animal welfare concerns, then, you know, that might be the way to go. The point that Peter and I were discussing the other day when we were just having a yak on the phone, and I think it's going to be mentioned a few times tonight, is that we are in a phase of the industry cycle where we should be aiming to look at the marginal returns rather than just aiming for cost control. So for some producers, I think that sort of requires some recalibration of the mindset. But yeah, we're going to mention that once or twice through the night. Okay, just for everybody's interest, that's the anthrax belt. So we would hope that all listeners tonight are sort of there or below. We probably won't mention anthrax again. And the other thing is that all of the people above that zone are probably tuning into the state of origin, and that's way more important than this, isn't it? Okay, let's talk about vaccine efficacy. And as I'm sure you're all familiar, this is the famous COVID-19 virus, or SARS-19 type 1, 2, or whatever it is. Why have I put that up there? Well, for the simple reason that the population's exposure to information on vaccines has been absolutely saturated since the advent of coronavirus. And so all of a sudden, I think that most of us realize, in fact, that vaccines don't always provide 100% control of any disease, even when it's used under the best conditions. So these are the conditions when the vaccines may not work like you want them. The clostridial diseases are absolutely the gold standard. So pulpy kidney, blackleg, malignant edema, black disease. If your vaccine program is up to date, and even in the face of very high challenge, you can expect them to work pretty much 100%. So failure can occur for a whole host of reasons. Firstly, you might have a non-inclusive strain of the bug that's causing a problem. So pink eye vaccine, I think, has 8, 9 strains. That's not all of them, not by a long way. And here and other cold climates in the winter, we see a closely related bug called Moraxella bovicola cutting a path of destruction, and the pink eye vaccine certainly doesn't work against that. Pasturella and Mannheimia are really closely related. We have a Mannheimia vaccine, but it doesn't provide much in the way of protection against Pasturella as an alternative sort of feedlot respiratory bug. The timing of your vaccination is absolutely critical. So if you're vaccinating in the face of an outbreak, just the very fact of a lag period after either 1 or 2 vaccines, depending on what's needed, means that the control that you get may be seriously compromised. Having said that, here I'm pretty happy to vaccinate, for example, in the face of pink eye vaccinations, provided it hasn't already gone through 30% of the herd. I think it's important to keep in mind how the vaccine works. So the bovine Johne's disease vaccine works by attrition. By that we mean, in fact, that over a period of time, it sort of reduces the number of animals that break down and have mega shedding, and so the whole contamination and reinfection cycle is slowly worn away. And so, in fact, if you're suffering losses from bovine Johne's disease, which I've got to say is actually fairly rare in the beef herd, then in fact, you're not going to stop it in the first year of vaccination, but over 4 or 5 or 7 years, the cases will dribble away to nothing. Now, that's in contrast to a toxoid, such as the tetanus toxoid or the pulpy kidney toxoid in the relevant vaccines, where you're actually producing antibodies against the toxins which those bacteria elaborate. And in that situation, you can expect damn near 100% coverage. It's important to keep in mind that there's an instruction sheet in the vaccine box, and it's worth reading. So both the number of doses and the interval are really critical. And sort of critical timing, obviously there's no point in giving a BVD vaccine halfway through pregnancy if in fact all of the damage is done in the first half. In terms of interval, I think it's fair to say that most vaccines have really good immunity. So it's absolutely critical that you take notice of the minimum time period between vaccines that require 2 or more doses, but you can usually stretch the outer limit to quite some extent. So once you've given a priming dose, then subsequent doses, provided they've met the minimum interval, the timing is not quite so critical. And I'd also point out that at least 2 vaccines are really, really fragile, those being the Babesia and the live Rhinogard virus. So if you happen to be using either of those, then it's really important that you pay attention to the cold chain. And finally, please don't be miserable. Every year we get phone calls from people saying, well, look, yeah, the packet says must be used within a month, but it's actually 4 months. That'll be all right, won't it? Well, look, I don't know whether it's all right or not, but the value of cattle is such that it's not worth taking the risk, particularly for sort of about 30 doses in the bottom of the packet as opposed to 200 in an unopened packet. Okay, so how do we value vaccines? There's a huge variation in the cost. So, for example, our clostridial vaccines are going to be less than $1 a shot, or about $1 a shot. But some individual vaccines are greater than $10. Some of our respiratory vaccines, Vibrio vaccine, and they tend to be used in combination. So, for example, if you're using a vaccination program before your cattle go into a feedlot, it'd be quite easy to rack up $40 or more in vaccinal costs alone. The thing is that vaccines are not like a nutritional supplement. So if you're selenium or copper deficient, we can sometimes predict what response that you're going to get from providing an adequate supplement, and we can certainly remeasure the responses to treatment, or treatments if you want to run a trial. And it's also not like vaccines in the pig and poultry industry, where because the animals are in close contact the whole time, in fact, without vaccines, many aspects of pig and poultry production would be essentially impossible. And in sort of developing countries, one of the best things we can do to help animal production, in fact, is just to introduce quite simple vaccines into pigs and poultry. So, in reality, we are frequently dealing with low incidence, low risk diseases, but with an all or nothing outcome, and that is, for example, sudden death. Therefore, I'm going to suggest that there's sort of 3 approaches that we might take depending on which diseases we're talking about. Firstly, animal welfare, we've already done that to death. the second is the insurance approach. So most of us, I'm sure, have house insurance, not because we want to call on it, but if we do need to call on it, then it's critical to have it in place. And in spite of the fact that you can do sums to show that you'd be better off self-insuring and putting the money aside, none of us ever do. So if you've got any sort of risk aversion, then you probably should consider vaccinating against clostridial diseases, at least for the high risk clostridial type diseases. But, you know, the reality is that they're not all that high risk. And then you can have a genuine risk analysis, return on investment type scenario. So the diseases that we can do that for, I guess those that sort of tend to affect production more than you know, causing sudden deaths: fibriosis, pink eye, feedlot BRD, and seasonal BEF come to mind. And if you follow that link to the sheet from MLA on southern vaccines, then in fact there's quite an interesting work example that on pink eye. So we won't go over that one, but we will be looking at another one later in the night. Okay, so down to the nitty-gritty. Let's start talking about some of the different aspects of production. And the first one off the rank is feedlots. And I'm hardly a feedlot vet, but I do spend a deal of time doing this at the feedlots that I do work at. And it's always a little bit disappointing. I hope you've all eaten, but these little white areas that we can see here and all through that, they're sort of micro abscesses associated with Pasteurella, I think, in this case. We see that with some frequency. So, in all likelihood, if you're any sort of scale of feedlot, you're going to have a veterinary consultant anyway. So I guess my comments are directed to people who are thinking about opportunity feedlotters or those who are about to start. The insurance vaccines, it's almost a no-brainer. So 5-in-1, animals on high starch diets are going to be at some risk of pulpy kidney. Malignant edema, pretty rare. Blackleg is generally associated with rough handling, but it's also quite zonal. But look, you're not going to separate out the various components, so bite the bullet and just do a 5-in-1. Now, here's the interesting one. So, respiratory vaccines is Mannheimia, which is a bacterial infection, plus or minus infectious bovine rhinotracheitis, which is a viral infection, plus or minus BVD, which is a systemic infection. So the general sort of thing is that IBR and BVD set the stage for Mannheimia and other bacterial infections to cut a path of destruction. So the amount of productivity loss from these two alone is generally, it can be, but generally not huge. It's the fact that they're the precursors to this one. You would think, given the value of cattle going into feedlots and the cost of keeping them on feed, that it would be a no-brainer that you would vaccinate against every disease that you possibly could. Here's the rub. The value of vaccinating against respiratory pathogens is highly contingent on how well they're backgrounded. So if you've got the opportunity to background for 28 days, so, you know, allowing the cattle that have been assembled to commingle, settle down, spread the diseases among themselves and be subjected to some level of socialization and handling, the value of those respiratory vaccines is actually highly dubious. The other thing to keep in mind is that there is a reduction in the average daily gain with the vaccine. So the vaccines actually cause systemic reactions which slow the rate of growth. If, on the other hand, you reduce that backgrounding period to 12 days, it's likely that there's going to be a very strong positive cost-benefit relationship. So in broad terms, the cost-benefit relationship is going to be greatest with a short backgrounding period, long transport, and I put in here for all our Tasmanian people who bring calves over from the mainland and vice versa for that matter, long transport times, and particularly sea transport. Age of the animals. Now, this is interesting in the south, as in southern Australia, because so many of our herds are infected with BVD at some level or another. So in fact, if you're taking your animals into the feedlot at 450 kilos plus and well in advance of a year, all of a sudden, the likelihood that they've been exposed to BVD naturally goes through the roof. So the net benefit of using a BVD vaccine may be diminished. Bottom line is that backgrounding is better than vaccination, but the more pressure you put on the system, so if for whatever reason you are forced to go straight from the sale yard pens into the feedlot pens, then you really need to rely pretty heavily on the respiratory vaccines. Pink eye, I think you find that most vaccines, it's pretty much on a lot by lot basis. So if they come into the pens and it starts spreading, then shooting pink eye vaccine into them can slow it quite considerably. And again, we've got this situation that if you start throwing antibiotics around, then all of a sudden you might be devaluing the product, the value of the product. Right, so what are some of the risks? Well, obviously clinical cases. If they're there, then provided there's not too many of them, that's an indication to vaccinate. Short backgrounding period, as we've already said, for BRD. And look, the one where we most frequently see large-scale outbreaks of pink eye, but it's more relatable to growers rather than feedlots per se, is this unbroken cycle of weaning, then off to the sale yards, and then off on some level of long-haul transport. And how they ever arrive at the other end as healthily as they do absolutely astounds me. But the more you can make that process gentle, the less likely you're going to have either pink eye or any other number of diseases. So that's all I want to say about pink eye. As I said, you really need a consultant, and there's not all that many sort of renowned feedlot consultants. They mostly work to many, many feedlots individually. But a couple of references here that you might be interested in. So the first is the Bovine Respiratory Preventive Practices Handbook by Paul Cusack, who's one of the renowned feedlot vets. Just Google it on the MLA. Oh no, not on the MLA website. You can never find anything on that. Just Google it, and that'll come up. And that tells you all of the things that you should be doing as well as vaccinating. And this second reference is an absolute corker because it explains the background that I was just talking about of, you know, a good backgrounding period diminishing the role for vaccines. So if you just Google Cusack, as in Paul Cusack, VetFest 2020, bovine respiratory disease, it's about a 20-page paper. And there's lots of references and lots of scientific jargon, but boy, is it a good paper. Okay, so the next step in the working backwards, I guess, in fact, is fattening animals and or backgrounding. By backgrounding, I mean growing them out to a specific size before they go into a feedlot. So here we have some steers that even after 4 or 5 frosts that have slowed everything else up, including me, these guys were still growing at close on 1 kilo a day, which they should be on that sort of brassica. Grazing turnips, beloved of Tasmanians, and the backbone of our feed. I'm sure you didn't wish to know that. So the starting point here is that high growth pastures and crop are inherently high risk for pulpy kidney at the very least. So the risk factors for the other vaccinable diseases, so pink eye and BRD, include holding in the sale yards, assembling of multi-vendor mobs, which I don't think I've mentioned before, but I should have under feedlots, the time spent travelling, standing around, and even yard weaning. So, you know, we're all great fans of yard weaning, but there's good versions and there's bad versions. And sometimes if you're doing it badly, then, you know, maybe you're better off just getting them out into a slightly bigger paddock to reduce the risk of a whole host of diseases. So here are the sort of recs that I'd be routinely running with my clients, and we do have quite a few people that buy and assemble mobs of calves and then grow them out either for the slaughter weight or at least for the feedlot. So the insurance vax 5 in 1. Main issue is going to be pulpy kidney. There's a possibility because of handling and jostling and everything like that of things like blackleg, maybe malignant edema, but yeah, pulpy kidney is the big one. So the standard recommendation for the northern tablelands back when the world was young, when I was sort of a new graduate, was that if you have animals growing rapidly on this sort of spring type pastures, they should be no more than 6 months since the last booster vaccination. So, you know, we generally, under low challenge conditions, expect that an annual vaccination against any of the clostridial diseases will keep all evil at bay. But under high risk situations, you may have to increase the frequency of that. Keep that in mind, please. Pink eye, look, this can cut a path of destruction in some mobs. It can certainly occur in association with yard weaning, particularly if the yards are dusty and they've got nothing but hay to graze. But it seems to me that the big outbreaks occur after this plexus of weaning, standing around in sale yards, and then transported on for variable distances and variable times. So the close contact, the stress, and everything like that can result in disasters. So one thing that's particularly important to note here, I think, is that sea transport seems to play an abnormally difficult role in this whole sort of pink eye scenario. So when we have droughted cattle coming over from the mainland, pretty much any part of the mainland, whether it's southern Queensland or Victoria, the trip across Bass Strait seems to invariably result in outbreaks of pink eye. So if you're assembling calves that have been sent via sea transport, first of all, try and use ro-ro type transport rather than unloading them onto barges. And secondly, be on the lookout for the possibility of pink eye. I would also again highlight the fact that if you're signed up to the GAP or some other QA program that prohibits the use of antibiotics, or at least discounts the prices after antibiotics are used, then all of a sudden the pink eye vaccine is probably a better proposition. And look, I'd have to say that there has been a lot of discussion in veterinary circles in the last 6 months about the value of pink eye vaccine, and some vets, in fact, are a little bit sceptical. All I can say is that the situations where we've used it, it seems to work fairly well, even when you vaccinate in the face of an outbreak, provided the outbreak hasn't been going any more than about a week. So that's not hard science, it's only an experience. So the respiratory vaccines that we talked about in relation to feedlots, they're rarely needed for assembled mobs of calves. So very rarely we've recommended that people do it for individual lots that had some issue. Again, usually associated with weaning sale yards and transport all in the one hit. But once that mob has settled down, we don't normally go back to anything, to doing it as a regular thing. Righto, so here we're coming to the interesting part. Heavens to Betsy's, we'll need to get on with it, won't we, Peter? Right, now this is going to be contentious. A few of the diseases that we're dealing with here, BVD and leptospirosis, are largely hidden. Even, you know, I mean, every so often you might get a diagnosis, but the real effect of these diseases could still be sort of undercover. I also want to address the OHS issues associated with lepto. But just like feedlots, the vaccine costs can mount very quickly. And to reiterate, with current high prices, look at the marginal return rather than just sort of not vaccinating because of cost control. Right, let's start with the bulls. You can have a reasonable expectation that your new bulls are going to be tested for BVD PI status. Notwithstanding that they're negative, they should be fully vaccinated against BVD. Why? Because even if they're not PIs and they're fully, if they're not vaccinated, if they contract it in the herd when they first go in with the heifers that has a PI in there, pardon me, there is a risk that the temporary fall in his immunity could affect his ability to work, and also there is also a risk that he could spread it to other animals which he has just gotten pregnant. So make sure that they're vaccinated, particularly heifer bulls, but for heaven's sake, it's not that expensive for an animal that's worth a lot of money. They should also be fully vaccinated against vibriosis. Now, this has been a wake-up call for me because it was essentially an unknown disease in the beef herd in Tasmania. It certainly circulated in the dairy herd for quite some time. But we've had, in the last 2.5 years, some absolute horror stories. And it involves either stray bulls and or bulls coming in that weren't vaccinated. Respiratory disease, vaccines. Look, if your bull vendor vaccinates against the respiratory diseases, apart from BVD, that is, then good on him. Wouldn't discourage it, but it probably doesn't have a whole lot of utility and probably not one to maintain. So on farm, heavens to Betsy's, the average price of bulls here in Tasmania this year is somewhere north of $12,000, the average price. One stud had an average price of $18,000. 5-in-1, preferably 7-in-1. It's just so cheap. You've got valuable animals, they fight. You don't want them going down with malignant oedema type disease and or blackleg. Maybe BVD, but highly unlikely. Maybe Vibrio, depending on the risk. So the two risks, I guess, which are identifiable where you should be revaccinating is if neighbours' bulls are in the habit of visiting, and obviously also if you know or you're highly likely that your own herd is is infected. So if you've got Vibrio there, then the vaccination of the bulls is as important. In fact, it's more important than vaccinating your breeders. So let's move on to breeding cows. Righto, so the first one is our insurance sudden death vaccines. I'm sorry, that's come up in the wrong order. Clostridial vaccine, 5-in-1 or 7-in-1. So why would we vaccinate against these diseases? In my practicing career, which is now damn near 40 years, I think I may have seen one case of a clostridial disease in an adult cow. And probably the reason that I returned that diagnosis is because maybe I'd returned a diagnosis of snake bite the week before on the same place, and so I was diagnostically destitute. Really, it's a very, very rare disease. The theory, of course, is that it provides colostral transfer for the calves, but most of the clostridial diseases occur after weaning, the exception being tetanus, which is associated with marking. But unless the vaccination is fairly close to marking, calving, you're not going to get huge colostral transfer. So value, doubtful, maybe not there at all. So look, my point of view is I would really prefer you to do it and just regard it as an insurance. I've got many clients who don't do it, and quite frankly, I'm not going to waste any more of my energy trying to get them to do it. But you've only got to save one cow every 10 years on current prices to justify the cost of a good 5-in-1 or 7-in-1 clostridial type program. We're going to come back to leptospirosis. Botulism and anthrax are obviously zone specific, so we won't address those here. Salmonella, all I'd say, in fact, is that it's primarily directed at the dairy game. If you have been diagnosed with an ongoing problem with Salmonella typhimurium, or what's the other one that's in the Salmonella vaccine? I can't remember. Isn't that terrible? Salmonella Dublin. Then it's probably going to pay handsome dividends, but you wouldn't be doing it speculatively. The reproductive diseases, look, vibriosis, we expect most herds to be free. So in broad terms, we're going to be managing that by buying vaccinated bulls and managing the risk mostly through vaccination of those bulls. So the greatest risk to breeding herds comes from stray bulls and fly-in, fly-out bulls. So in the last few years in southern Australia, I think there are some bulls of at least one breed that seem to have had more stops than a fly-in stallion. And their vaccination status is extremely dubious, firstly, and secondly, just because they're going onto multiple places means that they can create problems. So talk to your neighbours about their pregnancy diagnosis rates. If they're down to billy-o with no apparent reason, maybe have a bit more of a conversation about what their bull sources are, and if you think there's any risk of vibriosis, then you may speculatively vaccinate your cows, but the bulls are the greatest risk. If you are diagnosed yourself, then you can manage and eradicate vibriosis with appropriate biosecurity with a vaccination program. And that's going to vary a bit from place to place, depending on the age of the herd and where you found it and all those sort of things. So talk to your vet and come up with a plan. God knows we've spent enough time talking to clients in the last 2 years after the feces has hit the forcer. Leptospirosis. Again, in my 40-odd years in practice, I think I have seen 2 cases. One was frank abortions. The other one was, in fact, a discrepancy between what was preg-tested in calf and what actually calved. So, look, it's a common, seroconversion is as common as pie. 20-odd years ago, we looked for herds in this area that were free of lepto and BVD for a trial. We could not find a herd that didn't have strong titers to both, and that's in spite of the fact that they hadn't vaccinated against lepto. So what's the justification? It may be contributing to discrepancies between what's preg-tested in calf and what's actually dropping. But the big reason is the OHS, and as a veterinarian who's avoided it for 40 years, I don't really want to catch it in the twilight of my career, nor do your staff, nor do you. It's a really terrible disease in people. So look, you probably will not recoup the cost of lepto vaccines. It's about $4 to $5 per shot. So, marginal in terms of return. Look at it as insurance, but please do it. Righto, so here's the most important of all, and this is BVD. So this Paul was converted on the road to Damascus. I was always very cynical of the value of BVD vaccination just because so many of our herds have got it, and there's seroconversion by about 4 years of age. Okay, so we have high seroconversion rates, and sort of in southern Australia, the estimates are that something like 90% of herds have ongoing infection. So there are two scenarios. We can talk about a train wreck where naive cattle exposed to a PI with exquisite timing or bad timing. And then there's the chronic losses. Okay, so let's have a look at the train wreck. This is a case of BVD in a cow that broke down. This is a post-mortem from the same cow. You can see, in fact, she was a second calver, so she'd survived longer than most. Why was this a train wreck? Well, in fact, this was a herd of 2 assembled mobs brought out of New South Wales during the drought. One mob was totally naive. So in the other half of the mob, so the naive half of the mob, they lost something like about 10 out of 60 calves in a very short period of time, sort of before weaning. And then the typhoid Mary cow in the other half of the herd also broke down and died of BVD. In my time in practice, that is the only train wreck I've seen, so I'm going to leave it at that. So we're dealing with chronically infected herds, and in southern Australia, that's probably most of them. And I'd just remind you that, in fact, that BVD was the second, identified as the second biggest production loss disease in that review from 2015. So of your empty heifers, about 15% of them may be due to BVD. Can be much worse, in fact, if you happen to time your AI program with rapid spread through the herd. And we've seen that on a couple of occasions now, but most recently earlier this year. Here's a bit of a sleeper, and that's the increased neonatal mortality. So a lot of these calves are born alive, but in fact, they're just non-viable, and they die, frequently before weaning, but they're not accounted for as BVD deaths, just sort of calves that died for no apparent reason. There's also an increased mortality between weaning and 2 years. And if they break down with chronic BVD signs such as ill thriftiness or even, the slobbers and everything like that, then all of a sudden you say, holy heck, yeah, that's a BVD, but it's only one every 2 years, so we won't worry about it. Holmes and McGowan modelled this when the BVD vaccine first came on the market. Their conclusion was that the reproductive performance was severely impeded by BVD, and the more efficient your herd, the greater the path of destruction. So let's have a look at some of their figures. Oh, I'm sorry, just before we go to the figures, Richard Shepherd has done some more recent modelling for the dairy industry, and even as we speak, I hope he's working on beef herds as well. Okay, so this is the work from Holmes and Sackett. And this is the annual loss per breeder for a fairly efficient herd, not just in the heifer mob, but right across the mob. So what they're saying here is that if you've got 20% of the mob infected, whether they show signs or not, doesn't have to be a frank abortion or a dummy calf or anything like that, and you're getting sort of this spike in numbers every 3 or 4 years, that's the loss per breeder. Okay, so $28 and $21 respectively, 2008 prices, amortized over the previous 10 years. Again, Phil Holmes and Mike McGowan, they said that the vaccine benefit for a highly efficient herd that was being hit every 2 years is $34 per cow across the entire herd. I'm sorry, the vaccine benefit, not the vaccine hit, the vaccine benefit. And if in fact there's a lower percentage, but it's only been hitting them every 5 years, it's down to 0. So I tend to be concentrating on this figure here when I should have been concentrating on this figure here. But the thing to keep in mind, in fact, is that our prices have at least doubled. So we're not saying that the costs have not doubled. They've increased as well, but they're certainly not doubled. So all of a sudden, you know, this figure is probably 1.5, 1.75 times that. It's a no-brainer that we should be vaccinating against BVD. And that's my big conversion. I was looking at the wrong part of the table. I was looking here and here instead of looking here. So any of my clients that are silly enough to be listening, please take note. The advice is going to change. So start up a vaccination program in your herd. Look, if the prices drop away to nothing, then you can always look at reviewing it, but now's the time to be vaccinating. And if the prices drop away to nothing, then the chances are that you're probably going to go out of beef anyway. So calves, you need to vaccinate at weaning and then rely on the immune memory to see you through. I'm sorry, you need to vaccinate at calf marking and then again before weaning, and the immune memory will see you through from calf marking to weaning so that they're prepared to face the challenges after weaning. Oh, blast. Okay. So we're going to have a marking dose and then a pre-weaning dose or a weaning dose. Pre-weaning doses would be ideal. A weaning dose suffices in most situations. Pink eye can be a real issue, but given the determinants that we've talked about before, it's probably not on most people's agenda, and rightly so. Calf scours. Now here's the bit of a hidden problem, because in this part of the world we don't see much of it at all. Many years ago when I worked in Bairnsdale, I was staggered by the amount that we saw, and so having a calf scour vaccine available would have been absolute. You actually give it to the cow in advance of the calf being born, and so in some parts, well, for example, East Gippsland, I dare say it's probably still a problem, and you might well consider it. Respiratory vaccines are rarely needed unless it's a case of entering into contracts with feedlots to have them pre-vaccinated before they go through the ringer at the feedlot. Okay, so thank you for listening. Just to recap, tailor your vaccine program to your production system and identify individual risks. Just start thinking more about marginal improvements rather than cost control. Vaccines, in my reading, are a poor substitute for backgrounding, but if you can't background them or your backgrounding is inadequate, then you're going to have heavy reliance on the respiratory vaccines. Please vaccinate against lepto in just about everything, and BVD in breeding cattle, it's a no-brainer. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Paul. Very detailed, very insightful. We've already got a few questions that have come up. Before I get into them, please everyone remember to, if you've got the moment to spare, complete the survey on exit. I'll also have a slide up shortly, bear with me, on further resources. So our first question, actually from a dairy farmer, Paul. The scenario is 3 calvings per year. What would be the best time to vaccinate for BVD?
Okay, so the mea culpa is that I'm not a dairy vet. There's too much shit and mud involved in dairy for me to be a part of it. The critical thing is with BVD vaccines is to have the 2 shots in advance of the first pregnancy. So I guess our questioner might be asking the need for additional vaccines, and that's sort of a bit of a rabbit hole I don't really want to go down, because it depends on how much circulating virus there is in the herd. So if your heifers are protected and there's lots of circulating virus, then in fact you'll have top up without additional vaccines. But if in fact, or the longer you vaccinate, the less likely there is to be circulating virus, and the more likely it is that you will have immune drop-off. And in every situation, you need to be protecting before the pregnancy. So there's no withholding, so far as I know. It can be given any time, but initially the 2 shots before the first pregnancy, and then top-ups before additional pregnancies. That's probably an inadequate answer.
No, that's fine, Paul. Now, in terms of calf scours vaccinations, risk for Wagyu cross, would you recommend it?
I don't know of any specific risk associated with the vaccine, if that's what the question was. If the question is that whether the Wagyu calves are a particular risk of calf scours, then basically calf scours seems to me to be regional rather than breed associated. So if you're seeing it in your calves, then talk to the people at Zoetis or Coopers who manufacture the vaccine to come up with a program. I'm just not quite sure of the thrust of the question. I'm not aware of any issues specifically associated with using the vaccine in Wagyus. So if their Wagyus are subject to greater risk of calf scours, which has not been my experience, then by all means come up with a program.
That was the comment from the producer, that their experience is their higher susceptibility. What about Paul? Could it be bought in calf scenario we're talking? Would you recommend vaccine there?
If you're buying in calves?
Yeah.
Look, it depends on what age, but the calf scour syndromes are mostly immediately, postnatal, the first 3-4 weeks of life. So unless you're bringing them in very early, then it's probably not going to be a problem. But the thing to keep in mind, and probably I didn't bring this out, is that the vaccines for salmonella and the other calf scour bugs, actually probably should forget salmonella, the other calf scour bugs are actually given to the cow to transfer colostral immunity. Okay. So they're not given to the calf.
Great. Thanks for the clarification. All right. So under artificial insemination, would you vary a vaccine program?
Look, in my experience, and this is a changed point of view, the critical thing is to have them covered for BVD and lepto, without a doubt. So in so saying, I guess I'm suggesting that I think that in some situations, lepto might also play a role in early embryonic loss. I'm not sure of that. Anyway, look, the critical thing with AI programs is to make sure that the vaccination is completed well in advance of the start of the program. So BVD is a moderately reactive vaccine. I mean, it's not as bad as some, but given that it is moderately reactive, then you don't want animals with spiking fevers as they're being synchronized to be inseminated. So give yourself a good month between the booster that's required for BVD and starting your program.
Okay. Similar question. Can you explain the logic around 5-in-1 boosters, please, Paul? And if you're putting, in this scenario, pregnant cows or heifers onto oats or vetch, what's the ideal timing you know, pre-crop
Okay.
as a second booster?
Well, this is where it all becomes extremely murky. As I said during the presentation, I have never seen clostridial disease in adult cattle. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't exist. So in that scenario, if you were worried about it and you wanted to do it as a risk management thing, it needs to be done in advance of them going on to that rocket fuel type tucker. The trouble with that is that unless that happens to coincide with calving, which is probably a bit unlikely, then in fact you won't get the good cholesterol transfer for the calves. Does that make an enormous difference? Probably not. So in fact, if you weren't in a position to give them 2 vaccines, so one to protect them over their period of grazing the rocket fuel, and a second one immediately pre-calving. Now here's where I'm going to be shot down in flames, but I would say that it's probably more important to protect them on the rocket fuel than pre-calving.
Okay.
Is there any howls of protest coming through with that comment, Peter?
No, nothing yet. But Paul, I will flag. I've got a question for you. So along those lines, especially in the States and more recently here at home, seeing people vaccinate over and beyond the manufacturer's recommendations. So calves getting 3 or 4 hits by 12 months of age. Is there any evidence to support that is effective, or is there any detriment associated with that practice?
There's certainly no detriment with clostridial vaccines. They're not particularly reactive. To be frank, I've not read anything that suggests that it is a requirement when they're on high-risk situations, except what I mentioned previously, and that was that in the enormous springs that they can get in the New England, they used to talk about vaccination every 4 to 6 months, while ever they're under those high challenge conditions. And look, as a corollary, we're really stern about making sure that people vaccinate their lambs every 4 months when they're under high challenge situations on legume circles. So long answer short, no detriment apart from cost, and most of the cost is in the labour. And boy, you don't have to save many to make it worthwhile.
Okay. And I think I might have mentioned this would come up. Could you say what BVD stands for? And probably let's take it a step further there, Paul. Refer to the vaccine as well for BVD.
Okay, so BVD is bovine virus diarrhea. It's also known as bovine virus diarrhea virus, so BVDV, or pestivirus. The vaccine that is commercially available is called Pestigard, and that's the only one that's on the market in Australia, and it's a very good product. The thing about just very briefly to help maybe the questioners again, is the unique way in which BVD is spread. So it doesn't cause much impact in animals that are, well, basically anything that's born normal, has no ill effects except if they happen to catch it from what we call a persistently infected animal while they're pregnant, in which case we can see failure to carry, so abortion or resorption, dummy calves, and then calves that are born alive usually die before they're 3 years of age. The ones that are born alive shed virus to the rest of the herd, so they're the persistently infected ones. The other role that BVD plays, in fact, is in feedlots in particular, because when animals contract it from persistently infected animal either in the feedlot or in the preconditioning yards, the immunity of those animals that catch it goes down temporarily, and that makes them way more susceptible to a range of other respiratory viruses. So when I was talking about feedlots, I had BVD as a respiratory virus. It doesn't cause respiratory symptoms per se. It facilitates the entry of other bugs.
All right. Well, Paul, that was our last question. So thank you again for your time tonight and taking all those questions on board. For those still online, please remember the survey, and we will have another event in 2 weeks' time. We're just finalising the presenter as I speak. So thank you again for joining us. Hopefully the Blues get up, and you have a good evening.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Paul.